Welcome to East Coast Winemaking, the podcast that brings professional winemaking experience from popular wine regions on the East Coast of the United States to wherever you are. I'm your host, John Monier. I'm a Finger Lakes winemaker, and I'm excited to provide easy access to educational and entertaining interviews with other winemakers and industry professionals. In each episode, we'll cover the background and unique perspective of my guest on how they approach the craft of winemaking. I'm excited for the opportunity to learn from seasoned wine pros and hope these interviews can be informative to both colleagues in the industry as well as relative newcomers. Feel free to email questions or comments to eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com and follow us at East Coast Winemaking on Instagram to be notified when new episodes come out. If you're interested in checking out my wine called John Albert, you can find info on that at johnalbertwine.com. Hey everyone, today I'm bringing y'all a interview with my friend Taylor Stember. She's the head winemaker at a winery called Barnstormer. She's super driven and smart. She makes some very tasty wine. As always, we talk about her background, how she got into winemaking, and some of her winemaking philosophy. A couple of things that we touch on, she's making some very unique wines. A Saperavi, Sangiovese, Pet Nat, and a vermouth. We talk about those at the very end, so if you want to hear about her vermouth production, you're either going to have to listen to the whole podcast or scroll to the end. So anyway, I hope you all enjoy the conversation I had with Taylor. Taylor, how are you?
John, good.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for
here
having
in
me.
the Ravines Barrel Room. Can I first ask you to tell me a little bit how you got into the wine industry, where your interest in winemaking began, and how you found yourself in the position that you're in? I should just start off by saying Taylor Stember, head winemaker at Barnstormer Winery, located on the west side, Seneca Lake, down just north of like Watkins Glen, right?
South of Watkins Glen.
South of Watkins Glen.
Sorry, north of Watkins Glen.
Okay.
You're right.
So please, if you would fill me in on, from the beginning, how you got where you are.
Okay. I guess I got into winemaking because I was at UC Davis, not involved in the winemaking program in any capacity.
What were you studying at first?
Neurobiology.
Really?
Yes.
So you had hopes and dreams before becoming a wine person?
Yes, I was a person before wine.
Interesting.
But yeah, I was studying neurobiology. I really liked science, and that was I don't know. I thought that was what I was going to do. And then I took an intro to winemaking class, like Ven 3 or something, as an elective. And I thought it was really interesting. And at the time I was a freshman, and I was a little overwhelmed with my class sizes. Cause I was doing like all Gen Chem and physics and like those huge, I think they were like 500 plus person classes.
Whoa.
Because UC Davis is 40,000 students. And it was just a little overwhelming. And I felt like I came from a small high school. Going to this huge, big setting was kind of a lot. And the winemaking classes were all really small and really focused.
So you don't really care about winemaking. You just like being in small communities.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk to my professors and be seen. But I took a couple classes and I thought it was really cool. And I wish I had a romantic story, but I just switched my major. That was pretty much it, freshman year. And I never really looked back. But what got me was I saw a lot of people graduating with like general degrees out of a 4-year college. And, you have a general biology degree and you get out of college and you're some people had direction, but there was some people I saw that didn't really, what do you do with that? You're not a biologist at that point. You have to go to secondary school or keep doing stuff. And I saw the winemaking / viticulture degree, because at Davis it's both. I saw it kind of as like a trade. And it reminded me of like actually going to school and getting a skill. And I thought I would be able to graduate in 4 years, because that was the goal, and be able to then get a job. And I saw like utility in that degree. I was super interested in winemaking and grape growing, but I liked how practical it was. Like, you were trained, you could get an internship right after, you could travel, and the classes were fascinating. And at the time I was 18, like I needed to be entertained in my classes, you know, like in order for me to get excited about it and focus. And I felt really lucky that I found it at 18. I feel like I always would have found wine, or at least I tell myself that, but I feel lucky that it happened when I was 18 years old. And I got to study before you're in other countries, you're drinking at 18. So you can go wine tasting. You can go to other countries and go to wine regions. And I think people in other countries grow up with more wine in their life. Americans don't even get to really experience that until they're 21. And you're out of college by that point, you know? So I feel super lucky that I even knew it was a degree at all. And there's plenty of people who are amazing, super successful winemakers without any kind of training, like technically, but that's kind of what got me in the door. And I feel really lucky to have stumbled into that elective class.
Yeah, feels very lucky that you happen to be studying something not related to winemaking at UC Davis.
Yeah, I had no idea Davis was a winemaking school, but I didn't know winemaking was a degree. When you're in high school, no one is telling you that you can go into fermentation sciences and make beer or wine.
Right.
That's really cool. You know, if I knew that in high school, I might have been interested in that, you know? Like I drank kombucha and I thought making it at home would be really cool. Imagine if we did that in science class and then you got to take home a SCOBY and learn how to ferment things. You know, like that could lead people into a whole industry. And yeah, we don't do that here. There's no introduction to fermentation really in high school, I don't think.
I certainly never experienced anything like that. Anybody that I knew that was doing it because they wanted to have alcohol as a high schooler.
Exactly, yeah.
So at the time when you first decided that you were going to switch to studying winemaking, did you have in your mind that you were interested in being a winemaker or vineyard manager, or were you open to the possibility of being in sales and distribution or blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, I didn't at the time, like getting out of a 4-year viticulture and enology degree. I spent my entire undergrad working in vineyards and viticulture labs. So I was very vineyard focused, and I never really thought I would actually go into the winemaking side of it at that point, just because what I knew was viticulture and those were my favorite classes, probably just because you got to be outside. But after I graduated, I had spent like 3 years working in labs and vineyards, and I don't know, maybe it's the Libra in me, but I felt the need to balance it out. So I took a winemaking harvest because I wanted to experience the other side of it. I was like, do one harvest. My family, they were winemakers in Napa. I kind of wanted to pay homage to that. So I got an internship in Napa and tried it out. And it was good. It was really educational. I thought the high-paced aspect of the job and like the teamwork was really cool. And I wanted to then travel after that. So I just kept taking harvest internships because that was the easiest way to find jobs. I found, at least, to be able to kind of bop around and experience different regions. Vineyards hire interns and stuff, but it's more kind of organized, it felt, to find a winemaking job. Like it just felt like an easier kind of job to get, I guess.
Sure.
And it was after spending 3 years working in vineyards, then it almost felt like I was going to grad school, like going and doing internships, like and working harvests at different wineries. That was kind of like that felt like a secondary education because we had a winemaking class at school, but it wasn't like working in a winery, you know?
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with the program at Davis, being an alum from the Finger Lakes Community College. Is there is a hands-on like part of the education
Definitely.
With tanks and grapes and
we process.
pumps?
It was a class setting, you know, so we all stand around and watch a little, you know, lift, put grapes into a press, and then we all participate, and we got juice and we got to ferment it. So there was a hands-on aspect. The vineyard part of it was a little bit more hands-on, and it was a little bit more analytical. So like the chemistry classes were a little bit more of a thing, but we did have winemaking classes and sensory analysis classes, and
surely there was a winemaking chemistry class as well.
Definitely,
okay,
yeah. And I think that it's difficult on the northern hemisphere because harvest is in the summer, where in the southern hemisphere they can line up their education and their classes with the harvest season, and everyone gets to take the harvest time off actually as like a semester or a quarter and do a harvest, and that's part of the curriculum.
Interesting.
But in the Northern Hemisphere, it's harder to incorporate actually working in a winery,
Mm-hmm.
but they allow you to take time off to do it. But
sure. Okay, so where were a couple of the places that you internshipped along the way?
I started out in Napa on Howell Mountain, and then I went to Tasmania, Piper's Brook, and I was at Dalrymple. And then I went to mainland Australia, and I lived in Adelaide, and I worked in McLaren Vale for Yungara. And then 2020 happened, so I came back to the States, and I got a harvest internship at Red Newt Cellars. And then that ended my harvest intern career because I got hired full-time at Anthony Road here in the Finger Lakes.
What was the initial impetus to come to the Finger Lakes?
I really enjoyed being in Tasmania and the cold climate winemaking. And I wanted to keep kind of balancing. I did a hot climate harvest, and then I did a cold climate harvest, and then I did a hot climate harvest, and then I wanted to do another cold climate harvest. And I wanted to kind of tease out the region or the type of region that I wanted to work in eventually. And I kept coming back to cooler climates, and I was a little bit more interested in that style of winemaking, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then you ended up at Anthony Road, and you were assistant winemaker there.
Assistant winemaker, yeah.
And then there was an opportunity that you found at Barnstormer. And I know from talking to Peter in the past that he has said things like, when I bring in assistant winemakers, my point is for them to eventually become winemakers and then leave. Yeah,
Peter Beecraft, the winemaker at Anthony Road, he, in your interview with him, he will say, this is a stepping point. This is or a stepping stone. This is and it's just him in the cellar. So unless you take his job, there's nowhere to go. And that's kind of wonderful. He brings assistants in. You work right next to him. You learn so much from him. And then when a job opportunity comes up, he pushes you to take it. Every assistant I know that's worked for him has gone on to work at wonderful places, and it kind of started their winemaking career.
Yeah.
He encouraged me to take the job at Barnstormer, which was just having your boss, say to you that you're ready to do something kind of gives you all the confidence you need to then go after it. Because they're the ones who, he wouldn't have said that to me unless he wanted to get rid of me, or if he actually thought I could do it, but you have your internal monologue about what you can and can't do. And that was all the push I needed, I felt like, to then move into a head winemaking position. And now I'm at Barnstormer.
I wish I could remember exactly what he said to me, but August DeMille is a winemaker in the region, and when I was at FLCC, he was one of my teachers, and I had the opportunity to, I received a promotion that was going to have me working by myself a lot of the time, and I ran into August at Wegmans, and I told him about it, and I can't remember if I told him that I was nervous or whatever. And I wish I could remember exactly what he said to me, but it was something along the lines of essentially like, you're never going to be ready for the next step until you take it. And then it's like, once you have taken that step, you essentially learn to live that position just from being there, know? So what I'm getting at by saying that is, when you made that transition into the head winemaker position, did it feel like, was it exactly what you expected? Did it initially feel overwhelming? How did that transition feel from a human perspective for you?
Right. Yeah. I think the biggest change, one of the absolutely phenomenal things about the Finger Lakes is the community within the winemaking industry and grape growing industry. So I never felt alone. I feel so lucky to have the connections that I do here, and it's unlike any other region I've been in. Any time of the day, literally, I could call somebody and ask them a question when I was panicking about something, whether that was Peter, my old boss, or like another winemaker, you know, or a friend that is also in the region. So like, and, you know, moments of panic definitely happened, but I think having that support system made it so much more bearable and exciting. There were definitely moments where I kind of wanted to work on not reaching out for help and, you know, solving problems myself and not always just relying on asking questions. Because when you're an assistant, you always have a winemaker to immediately talk to in any given second. You know, something happens, you're like, what do I do? How do I do this? What would you do? You know, you're learning. And then when you're alone, you don't have someone to ask those questions. And or not physically around you. You can always call, but it was good to force myself to like problem solve before reaching out, and having reaching out be kind of the last resort.
Right.
But that community and that support system made becoming a head winemaker from assistant really, I don't want to say easy, but it made all the difference.
Sure. It reminds me of when the gentleman who was my boss, assistant winemaker here at Ravines, and he left, and I asked to be considered for his position, and I was put in for a trial period. And whenever I had questions, my brain wanted to like call this guy who was no longer working here anymore. Darren Scott, shout out. And it felt like it didn't hit me until years later, but developing the image in your mind of deciding that it's something that you're going to solve and not look for information on how to solve it from like somebody else almost seemed like a learned skill, you know? I mean, it's something that kind of like I was saying before, it sounds like it's been both of our experience that you have to be put in a position where you can exercise those muscles, where you have problems and you have nobody to get those questions, to get those answers from. That makes you self-sufficient in the long run. Yeah,
totally. And, you know, it's that I notice that when I'm blending now, you know, like
tasting, especially
tasting alone is, I want to ask questions all the time. Every time I taste something, I second guess myself, and I don't think that'll ever go away. But even today, like I was blending and I just did a final taste through of all of my red barrels for the Cabernet Sauvignon blend. And one of them, I was like, you know, is there a little bit of VA in this barrel? Or I don't have the technology to run those numbers and get the answer immediately. I have to do it based on like my sense of smell and taste. But I could send it away, but I was like moments away from blending it, you know, and that would change the whole bottling schedule. And you just kind of have to either decide to forego that barrel or risk it when you're having those moments of doubt, you know. And I don't have anyone in my immediate vicinity to run up and ask a question, where when you're an assistant, you can just walk over to the winemaker and be like, what do you think?
Somebody works in the tasting room and be like, does this smell a little bit like vinegar to you?
You know, and if you say that, like, I'm like, I'm tasting these barrels to check for VA. Am I, you know, putting that in my head before I even smell it? You know, it's such, I trip myself out with it, but, I do miss a bit of a team and just being able to like ask people like immediate questions, the kind of like, hey, am I crazy kind of question, or is this real? But
I totally get that. I had an experience just this past week where I did the exact same thing that you're describing.
Yeah, you want a second opinion. And you know, like the owner of Barnstormer is great. If he's around, I can ask him these questions, and you know, he's got a great palate, but you know, you're not. It's down to kind of the winemaker to make that call at the end of the day, and I'm supposed to be the skilled one, so
the head honcho, honchess.
Yeah.
Maybe you've touched on it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you have anything to add or anything that comes right to your mind about what your favorite thing is from your perspective now about being in the wine, being a head winemaker and in the wine industry in general.
It's funny. It kind of goes against everything I was just saying, but I think one of my favorite things is the autonomy, and being able to create something that you like. I think with any kind of like small batch or creative or crafty food or beverage product, hopefully the people making it love what they're making. And I think my favorite part of this job is that I get to do what I love. That maybe is vague, but like, every wine I feel like I have a connection with, and it's so cool to see it from like birth to bottle, like to kind of raise these wines all year and then bottle them and send them off and, put them out into the world, and to create something that you're proud of it feels good to make something.
Totally.
Yeah.
Birth to bottle. I've never heard it put like that before, but that's something that should be on a t-shirt or something like that. Birth to bottle.
I feel like harvest, you're like, I don't know. It's a new vintage, and my birthday is usually the first day of picking or processing or whatever. It's every year. And I feel like I'm starting my year with this vintage kind of, and it's a little,
how appropriate. It's
a little silly, but like, I don't even want to celebrate my birthday. I just want to celebrate like the first day of harvest, because it's like the beginning of your whole year. That's that's day one of our cycle.
I do think that most people in the wine industry are romantic people in general.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of people would resonate with that.
Yeah, probably.
Well, this gets into a question that I was going to ask you later, but you're kind of hinting at it right now. Do you feel like at Barnstormer you have carte blanche to dictate the style however you want? Or alternately, is there like a house style that you are perpetuating?
I think there's a little bit of both. I think that there are some wines that are like so loved by the consumer, and it kind of is Barnstormer's style, that we kind of keep those as they are, regardless of who the winemaker is. But like the Barnstormer team is always trying to improve. So if I have an idea about how I think a wine might, work a little bit better, or like everyone is excited to try that out. And I think every year that winery is doing something new, and if that's my idea or not, that's the mentality, So I don't know if I think it's a team effort. But if I have an idea, they're super open to it, and there's no pushback. And everyone's kind of willing to try something. And then if it works, great, we can keep doing it that way. And if it doesn't, then we'll change next year. But, the only thing that, I get excited about stuff, and I want to do like 50 new things every harvest. And there might be like, okay, that's not physically possible kind of things. But whenever we want to try something new, everyone's stoked about it. So I don't know if I have like total like control over everything, but my ideas are taken very well, and
sure.
we work together to kind of make everyone excited and happy about what they're doing. And I definitely get to try new things and bring new SKUs in. And like last year, we did 3 dry Rieslings. 2 of them, I kept them kind of standard Barnstormer style. And then 1 was from a vineyard we never worked with. And I got to basically create a style out of that Riesling. So, it's kind of like every year we change one thing. Like I felt like the last 2 years I've really been honing in the Rieslings and trying to kind of tighten that program up and get those to a place that I feel confident replicating every year. And then this year, my goal is to kind of like switch headlights over to the reds and just kind of like see, pay a little bit more attention to what yeast I'm using for each lot, and play around with how I can maybe add a little bit of complexity here, or like, just so it's kind of cool every year, like to have a new project that you want to focus on. And I think little by little we change, but it wasn't an overhaul when I started.
Sure. Hearing you say that makes me really interested in tasting more of the Barnstormer wines, just because it's exciting to hear when there are places that support the idea of experimentation in the name of increasing quality.
Totally.
You know, I mean, there's a lot of tradition in winemaking, and that's not inherently a bad thing, but maybe I'm also a little bit biased because I feel similarly that my inclination is to wonder what we can change in the name of making things more unique, you know?
And it gets easy to, you know, when my first harvest, I was like, okay, what yeast did you use for every lot? How did you do this? I wanted to just learn how they did it because I didn't know the vineyards. We do everything at Barnstormer, single vineyard, and it's all vineyard designated on the bottle. So I can't, if something goes wrong with one lot, I can't really blend in another lot, you know? But my first year, it was just kind of like getting to know the facility and the equipment, and I didn't want to change anything. And then the second year, I felt comfortable with everything to an extent, and then that's when I felt like I really got to be experimental, and gaining the trust of, you know, the owner and showing them that you can actually get wine into a bottle, you know, like that's huge. They'd hire someone they don't know. How do they know that you can, like, I just wanted to kind of prove that I could, you know, make wine. And then if everyone trusts each other, then start getting kind of fun and having, you know, spreading your experiments out. For example, we have this one vineyard that we have sourced from pretty much since the beginning of Barnstormer. And I think it was always made kind of in one lot, in one way, you know, a dry Riesling, very delicious, very fresh. And when I started, I wanted to see if I could kind of, I don't know, I wanted to see what that vineyard site wanted. So year one, I did stainless steel versus oak fermentation with it. And I wanted to see what vessel worked better for it.
Were the barrels neutral, or did they
were
have
neutral
some
white
life?
barrels?
Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to see like if that could add, you know, a little bit with the fermentation kinetics and all of that. So I preferred the stainless steel. So the next year I did a control where I kept all the same vessel. So everything was stainless steel, but I did 5 different ferments with different yeast because now I wanted to figure out, okay, what yeast does this vineyard want? And actually I loved all 5 lots blended back together. I thought it was super interesting to have all these different fermentations. And you know, I was aiming for a dry style. So one of them went bone dry really fast because the yeast acted differently. So then I had to terminate another one with a little bit more RS, you know, to balance it out. I wanted like kind of a just off dry style because the acids from that site is really high. And stopping the fermentations at all these different parts of the different fermentations, I think captured different, I don't know the technical term for it, but like on the fermentation curve, if you stop it at like 8 bricks for one lot versus 0 bricks for another lot, your yeast are in a different like life stage, right? So they're producing different things. I could be totally wrong, but I think this is true. And one might be producing, you know, more esters, and you capture it in that moment and terminate the fermentation. And then you have a bone dry one that's maybe a little savory, and you can blend them together. And not only are the yeast adding complexity, but the stages of fermentation are adding complexity.
Interesting.
And I thought that was really fun to play around with, and having like the same lot split into 5 different lots and then monitoring those fermentations was really cool.
I want to ask you about what you know about Barnstormer's origin story, but before we get too far away from this, because we've touched on a topic that I think is interesting, in your experience, how much of a role does yeast play in what the final outcome of a wine is going to be like? Because there are some people that suggest that the yeast choice is very important, and that has implications on native spontaneous fermentations or not, or what lab strain you're buying. And then there are people on the other side of the spectrum that say it really doesn't matter,
right?
Or maybe I should say it mostly doesn't matter, and that the wine is going to be the way that it wants to be in the end, no matter what. So based on your experience, what's your feeling on that? Just since you were talking about this 5 yeast experiment.
Right. Yeah, I can touch on that because it was funny. You know, you hear all these things about yeast, and I personally think yeast is important. It's the other winemaker. You know, there's the 3 things that affect wine: yeast, the winemaker, and then time. obviously there's tons of other things, but those are like the 3 big ones. And I think that in those 5 ferments, I did some spontaneous, and then I did Saccharomyces, like yeast strains that I bought from a lab, and all of the ferments tasted completely different. I replicated 2 of the yeast just to kind of have a bit of a side-by-side control.
Where you had 2 separate vessels that were fermenting with the same yeast?
With the same yeast,
oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
And like I would taste through every day when I was doing my fermentation checks, and they tasted and smelled different. Like
the vessels with the same yeast.
No, all the 5 different ones.
How did the 2 vessels with the same yeast, did they show very similar or identical? Or
they were very close. Yeah,
okay.
They were really similar. They, there's always tiny little differences. But they were the most similar. They finished right around the same time. They followed the same kind of stages of fermentation. And then the other 3 kind of all did their own thing. But the spontaneous one obviously took like 2 weeks longer than the other ones, and took maybe a week and a half longer to start, the classic kind of spontaneous ferment curve. But the others, yeah, like I would smell one, I was like, oh my God, apricots. And then the other one would be like grassy and green. So from that tiny little lot experiment that I did, I noticed a huge difference. And I'm starting to get to know yeast, and I think I can even start to slowly identify the ones that I work with based on the ferment. Like if someone brings something to me during harvest and asks me to smell it, I'm starting to kind of pick up characteristics of the yeast that I've been working with every year.
You're like, oh, this is D47 all day long
yeah.
or whatever.
Well, they have their obvious, things, and I think spontaneous fermentations are really exciting, and I want to, every year I tease in a few more, because I'm getting more comfortable and more confident with the fact that they actually will, finish.
Yeah. I want to ask you more on exactly that experience, the difference between inoculated yeast and spontaneous fermentations. But before I think that's going to be the beginning of a rabbit hole down like the winemaking, what you're doing in the cellar. Can I bring you off track a little bit, and then we'll come back to what Barnstormer's story is, the amount that you know about it?
Definitely. Yeah. Barnstormer is 11 years old and
a baby in comparison to, I had no idea that like Atwater was open since like the 70s or something like that. I had no idea that there were all these old wineries. So I'm glad that we're getting a little change in that. There's some, some relatively young. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really cool working for a newer winery. I will say, I'll get into the history of it, but it's one of the things, like you asked if I had, my way in the cellar sort of, and working alongside the owner and for a new winery, like they're figuring out what their style is still kind of, he definitely has honed in like an incredible way of making wine, but it's only 11 years old, so that's a little blip on some of these places' timelines. And that's really cool for me because I get to kind of fall into step with them and grow with them. And that feels really cool. And I feel like I'm growing, and also being a part of a winery that is physically actually expanding is really cool and really educational. You get to be a part of just picking out tanks and stuff like that, which you don't always get to do. And that's a really cool thing to learn how to kind of start thinking about. But anyways, yeah, young winery, really great. Scott Bronstein, the owner, bought it. He bought this old barn. It was a sheep barn that's been around since the 1800s. And he saw, it was a winery before he bought it. But he kind of turned it into what it is now. He's totally renovated all the property. He's put in vines. There's so many plans for the future, which is really exciting.
It's a really nice space that they have there.
Beautiful. Yeah. He's done so much work. I would love to see what it looked like before he kind of got in there, and he kind of gutted everything and kept a lot of the old, like walls and, wood. And you feel like you're in a barn, but he's modernized it a little bit. And A, you had to make it safe, but B, it feels nice. You feel comfortable. It's one of those tasting rooms you walk into and you feel like you're at home, and everyone just like takes a seat. There's a fire. There's a cat that'll crawl up in your lap. It's a really comfortable environment. And he's done a really great job creating that. But yeah, Barnstormer, Scott bought it, converted the barn into a pretty functional winery. It already was, but he kind of did a lot of work to get it up to snuff, and then put vines in the ground, and they've been kind of rocking ever since. He started out doing everything himself, and this is the Finger Lakes, so he had help from all of his neighbors and winemakers all around, and he got a lot of great people on board. But he then hired a winemaker full time, and he kind of stepped into like the proprietor role because owning a winery is a lot of work, and that's worked out really well for the business. And Barnstormer, I think, it's a barn, and a barnstormer is a plane that flies through and does tricks through barns.
Oh, interesting.
If you didn't know that, it's like a trick plane. So that's kind of where the name came from.
That makes sense. I knew that they had planes on the labels.
Yeah. So he wanted to tie the barn into, he has a deep family connection with planes. I think his grandfather was a pilot. And so that kind of brought, his family and his story together as one. So that's really cool.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So now to ask you about some of your winemaking practices.
Yes.
I was planning on asking you about some of the things about the single vineyard Rieslings that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you touched on them as we were discussing earlier. I'm going to ask a question that is kind of two things, and I'm hoping that you can just run with it because I don't know how to break it down more appropriately. Cool. My initial question was in regards to making single vineyard Rieslings. Mm-hmm. I assume that they show very differently from one another.
Yes.
Okay, that was the appetizer question.
Okay. Yes.
The entree question is, in your opinion, is there a way to treat Riesling in the cellar in the name of like letting the terroir speak, what I would call like transparent winemaking, where your intention is to like let the vineyard and the fruit speak for themselves? Are there practices that you feel like you practice, or is there a philosophy that you have to get those wines to sing the way that they do and be separate? And then kind of added on to that, or maybe you can piggyback after you say however you feel about that. You spoke about how a couple of those single vineyard Rieslings you're vinifying in different ways, and I'm interested in hearing some more of the nuances about that. Sure,
yeah.
Sorry, I know that that's a huge mouthful.
No, I think I remember the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. You can remind me if I get off track. But I like your question of letting the single vineyard show through and how you can kind of respect them with winemaking.
Yeah. Like, do you think they just do that on their own? Or do you feel like you have to treat them a specific way to get them to tell the story that they want to tell?
I think I would have to ferment everything exactly the same with the same yeast in the same volume to get a perfect answer for you. I will say that I react to the different vineyards in a way that I think allows them to express themselves in the best way possible. And I will explain that in more detail. Well,
kind of like you were saying earlier about how, I can't remember what you were saying, but you were saying that you were letting the wine talk to you.
Yeah, I think I have a good example between my Teller Vineyard and my Sawmill Creek Vineyard Rieslings. So, and every year this could change based on ripeness. Like this isn't a recipe. It's kind of reactionary to what the year gives us. But this year, Sawmill Creek showed up really ripe, really, good bricks, like came in at 22 bricks and good flavor, lower acid. And so I responded to those numbers and I cold soaked it for 3 days. which lowered the acid even more a little bit. But because it was more ripe, I felt like it had lower bitterness, and the acids weren't going to fight with the phenolic extraction that I was going to get from the skin contact. So I kind of followed the numbers and then chose the style of winemaking I wanted to do based on those numbers. And then, so yeah, that got a 4-day cold soak, super long lees in integration with that wine. I just kind of let it hang out on there because I noticed that the acid and the bitterness were kind of in check already. And it got, it was pretty much bone dry. I didn't need any RS to kind of balance anything out. Teller Vineyard, completely different side of the spectrum. Came in lower bricks, really high acid, really low pH. I didn't want to let that sit on its skins. I thought that would I thought that maybe people do that, but for me, I didn't want to add phenolic to that.
You were afraid it might get texturally a little aggressive, maybe, or something like that?
Kind of. Or I wanted to keep it, I wanted to help it get fresh and balanced and, yummy without these kind of contradictory mouthfeel things going on. So while I may not ferment them all the same to be able to see what the terroir is, I respond to what the terroir is of those vineyards and decide on how to make the wines in the most appropriate way, I think, suits those wines.
Sure.
So it's kind of like chicken or the egg. But I do think if I fermented them all the same, they would still be slightly different.
Sure.
Because they're coming in at different chemistries, because, vineyard practices are different and the clones might be different, so I don't know how much of it is strictly terroir. I think that's a part of the pie, but I don't think it's, 100% of why they taste different. As soon as they get picked off the vine, they're changing at different rates. If they're picked in the middle of the night or in the morning,
sure,
all these things start changing and affecting the wine. So it's really hard for me to say what is terroir and what isn't. Also, am I part of the terroir, because I live here and I live in the Finger Lakes?
Yeah, it depends who you ask.
Exactly. Yeah. I've learned from Finger Lakes winemakers, my mood is good because the weather's nice that morning. I don't know. So yeah, but, so I think I answered your question. I don't know how much of it is terroir, but I definitely respond to what is coming in and what the vineyard is telling me in my mind to do.
Sure.
And, I would love to play around with cold soaking and giving lower pH wines skin contact. And I've done it a little bit, but I haven't bulked it up. But I like the ripeness of one lot. So I want to extract it more. And then when another lot doesn't have as much ripeness, I kind of balance that out in a way, or try to.
Totally makes sense. I think that's a perfect answer. I'm a Chardonnay freak, and I know that you're making Chardonnay.
Mm-hmm.
Will you tell me a little bit about the style that you're chasing and how you vinify it?
Sure. Yeah. Chardonnay. I really like making Chardonnay. I did 100% stainless steel, and it went through mallow, I believe, during fermentation. So it's, I think, kind of like pineapple-y and creamy at the same time.
Oh, a little bit of,
it's got
like
tropical,
both sides of Chardonnay.
Yeah.
Some fruit and some
it's
some
like
cream.
a upside down cake, maybe. It's got a little bit of the brioche. And I got it off lees earlier maybe than I could have, but I was, you get a little nervous sometimes when you smell them. And I racked it off lees probably 6 months after the fermentation stopped, and that cleaned it up really nicely. And it aged in stainless steel until we bottled it. But it's, I think it's really, I don't know I'm trying to think of a word that I haven't used 100 times to describe a white wine that's not crisp or fresh.
Zesty.
Zesty, zippy.
Unique.
Your favorite.
No.
No, I think it's yummy. That's my favorite word.
So did it not see oak?
It did not see oak. No.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
But it going through mallow during fermentation gave it a little bit of that lactic classic Chardonnay.
It did,
lusciousness, and probably the lees too.
Yeah.
While I'm thinking about it, when you're aging on lees and or thinking to yourself about the interaction between lees and wine. Are you on full fermentation lees?
Yeah. Pretty much across the board, all of my white wines sit on fermentation lees until I bottle.
Do you ever sample the lees to check if they're clean and fresh?
Yeah, definitely. I'll taste through. So there are some occasions where I will rack off of the lees if I'm noticing reduction or some other kind of issues. I definitely was a part of the 2021 vintage here in the Finger Lakes, which for me was a huge learning lesson just in the terms of reduction. So anything that in my mind reminds me of 2021, I'll get a little nervous about, but if they're clean and tasty, I will leave them on lees for, as long as I can, pretty much. I would like to leave them longer. And I do lee stirring as well.
Do you just like lee stirring in stainless or oak?
Both, yeah.
And then is that just bubbling through the bottom valve to like kick them up? Or do you have small enough tanks that you can like get your feet in there and kick around or something like that?
I don't use my feet, but I would do the bottom valve.
I just need to say for my reputation that was a joke.
No, you put your feet in them.
Yeah.
I have this long PVC pipe thing that I've attached an adapter to hook up to my gas tank so I can get into all the nooks and crannies.
Oh, and really like lift it all up off the ground. So that's a great idea.
I learned that from Kelby at Red Newt. He had one of those. And he is kind of the king of lees and, delicious reduction. So it was cool to learn those tricks. But yeah, I mix it and bubble it, and bubbling from the bottom valve just wasn't enough for me. So I needed to kind of get everything moving, and I wanted to see, chunks rolling through the tank. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
How comfortable do you feel playing with reduction? I mean, are you of the mentality that as soon as it's stinky, you figure out how to treat it? Or are you prepared to tolerate a little bit of tightness and maybe a little bit of funk?
I think I'm pretty lenient when it comes to reduction.
Really?
Yeah, definitely. I like to lean into it. I like my wines to be reductive coming off of harvest, coming off of fermentation. I will deal during bulk fermentation, like I will add nutrients if I need to. I don't want anything stinky. I don't want my yeast to be super stressed, but towards the end of fermentation, I like a little bit of reduction, and going into winter, I love having a blanket of reduction on all of my white wines. And that's another reason why I leave them on the lees for so long. I think it adds a lot, and I've gotten really comfortable letting them be really reductive and then just kind of trusting the process. And 9 times out of 10, if it's the transient style of reduction, they will kind of clean up. And I think of reduction as a
tool.
Yeah, tool, kind of a blanket. So if you're putting your wines through a filter and racking them and moving them, every step of the way you're adding oxygen. And I think reduction, protects you every step of the way up until bottling. And then even after at bottling, I make a decision based on reduction. My closure is typically decided based on what the wine is tasting like. So I don't really feel like I go corkscrew or screw cap versus cork like religiously. I had a Gruner that was kind of reductive, so I put it under cork, hoping that it would breathe a little bit more, and then screw cap for wines that I kind of want to like lock in where they're at a little bit more. And I don't know if that's a perfect science. Doesn't always work exactly that way, but it's kind of nice to be able to have that option.
Sure, that's interesting. I was going to ask you about closures in the long run, but I think just that tidbit has given us a good insight on how you feel about different closures and their use.
Yeah, I think that it's like the last tool we get to kind of use in the winemaking process.
Yeah.
And it'll help establish what the style of the wine will be.
The next wine that I want to ask you about is the single variety Cab Sauv. wine.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically what I wanted to ask you about is I was a little bit surprised to see it as one of the wines that Barnstormer was making, only because I've not asked people this explicitly enough to be confident in what I'm about to say, but I feel like it's a lot of people's concern in the Finger Lakes that maybe it doesn't get either ripe enough to be on its own, or it's just best in this region in Bordeaux style blend, which is almost always, I mean, it feels like 90% of the time where you see it. I know that there are a couple other red Cab Sauves out there from the Finger Lakes and maybe a couple rosés, but in your experience, how do you feel about it, working with it as a single variety, and how are you treating it, even if your answer has to change a little bit from less ripe vintage to more ripe vintage in terms of punch downs, pump overs, that sort of, and what you expect to get out of it?
Right. Yeah. I just blended ours today. I wish I
topical.
would have brought some in. Yeah. Well, I first would like to say you should come down and taste a single varietal Cab Sauv in the Finger Lakes at the winery and see what you think. Because I think it's interesting to try, at least. But before I came here, I was in Tasmania, and they have a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon, and they have similar. I mean, I think they're like a sparkling Pinot Noir Chardonnay region, right? So cooler climate, kind of those Alsatian varieties, and they also do a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon. And when I was over there, I had just come from Napa, where Cab is king, and they're these big, ripe, huge wines. And that's kind of what I thought Cabernet Sauvignon was. And then I went to Tasmania, and everything in Tasmania, they're the opposite end of the spectrum from what I've seen. You bring up the idea of bell pepper to them, and they're like, great. We love it. They lean into it.
Interesting.
Most of the wines I had over there were super peppery, super green. And, it might have been the year that I was tasting, and maybe it was just because I was experiencing cold climate Cab Sauv for the first time, so it really stuck out. Maybe someone who lives there would disagree with me, but I remember thinking they were really green and peppery, but they owned it, they were happy with that style. That's kind of what they wanted to do with that grape. And then I came here, and there's this huge conversation about pyrazines, and, it's almost a flaw, I think, to winemakers. They are
more or less considered the devil, it seems like.
Right, yeah, and
it's one of the few things that I think I'm actually blind to. I, for the life of me, cannot ever, I've never smelled bell pepper.
I think I have a lower tolerance to it as well, but I can tell if it's there or not. It just doesn't really bother me. So Cabernet Sauvignon in this region, it's never going to be the Cabernet Sauvignon that you're drinking from the West Coast. It's never going to be like it is coming out of France. And I think that, I like making it. I think it's tasty, and it's really, it doesn't have a huge amount of weight to it, but it's got flavor, and it's more of the raspberry side of things. It's not going to be your black, plums and leather and tar. It's kind of, it fits more into like easy drinking, lighter bodied red. And arguably, I think Cabernet Sauvignon, when I compare it to maybe like a Syrah or a Merlot from this region, sometimes I think the Cabernet Sauvignon actually kind of fits a little bit better. Or I don't want to say better, but like I kind of enjoy that, because I feel like with Cabernet Sauvignon here, we're not trying to force it to be anything, where sometimes with the other varieties, people want to make these big wines because of the reputation of Syrah and stuff. I've had amazing Merlots and Syrahs from here, but I guess I like the pyrazines. So maybe that's my answer, and why I like making it.
You've learned to love them through your experience.
Kind of, yeah. But even the one that I'm making right now, I don't get pyrazines out of it. It's just a little bit lighter bodied and more fruity. But I think that argument can be made for any red that we make here. Like, try any red wine and compare it to a different region. Ours are going to just show differently,
Of course.
But Cab Sauv is one that you don't see as much, so I understand.
So when you say lighter body, should I infer from that you're intentionally going a little lighter on the extraction that you are trying to coax out of those grapes? Tell me a little bit about the extraction and the vinification. I
make all my red wines pretty much the same. So I don't really I'll do a little bit of a yeast difference maybe. And some get longer extended maceration or a little bit more cold soaking, but pretty much they get treated the same with ferment management. So I'm not trying to over extract or under extract anything. I kind of ferment them all the way to when I start to notice the cap kind of sinking, and then I want to get them out of there and protected. So it's more of a fighting flaws kind of fermentation style.
What about pump over v punch down? How do you use those tools separately, and what do you expect from them?
Well, I've worked with both styles of fermentation management. At Barnstormer, I've only ever done punch downs, mostly just because we had one pump and I had to use that for white processing most days. And then the reds kind of got their morning, midday, and afternoon punch downs. But I couldn't divert a pump to do pump overs. But this year we have 2 pumps and we might play around with pump overs.
Exciting.
Yeah.
I went on a little bit of a tirade with Peter Beecraft about punch overs v pump downs. And you probably know that since you were working at Anthony Road, and he was talking about how some of the tanks that he have always receive pump overs. And then if there are other bins, because it's a big enough vintage, he'll do punch downs.
Yeah.
And I haven't stopped thinking about it since we talked about it like last weekend, about what his opinion was in the differences that he saw in those 2 grapes. And that conversation alone is undoubtedly going to change some of my winemaking in the future.
I love pump overs, and I would love reds to be fermented in tanks. You know, I think that's wonderful. Are
you fermenting most in bins at this point?
We're doing everything in bins. Yeah. That's just kind of a logistical thing, but yeah, I think pump overs are super fun. I think just the protection from oxygen is such a big thing with tank pump over fermentations, and like the accumulation of heat that you can get. But I would love to do a comparison with pump overs and punch downs and actually compare what it does to fruit from our region. Cause I know in other places, people want to do pump overs cause it's lighter, it's less extractive. But yeah.
Yeah. Here at Ravines, we basically have a regimen of punch downs and do pump overs when we feel that the wine needs them, if it's getting a little reductive, or when we do nutrient additions.
Right.
So we kind of are always doing both. And the thought of being in a place where there was like one that was one way and one that was always another just made me really excited because it seemed like a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about a couple more of the more niche style wines that you're making. I haven't talked with you at all about them. So for all I know, they're both projects, but I want to put that to the side. Maybe we can kind of wrap up with it. I'd like to ask you just some general like winemaker questions.
Yes.
So we were talking about inoculated versus spontaneous fermentations. In general, do you see pros and cons to one versus the other when you're thinking about like using them separately and putting them together?
You mean like blending a spontaneous ferment with a inoculated ferment?
Yeah, I guess. How do you use them as tools cohesively?
Right.
Because it sounds like you do some of each. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I like using both. Totally. Yeah, I think spontaneous is really fun. And I actually really like some of the yeast I work with. And I think that the kind of trendy thing is to just do, all spontaneous. Or I don't know if trendy is the right word, but people, that's always been a huge conversation, is spontaneous versus inoculated. And some people almost like think they prefer one or the other. And I love playing around with both. And I think that I don't have control over my vineyards. I source fruit from different vineyards. So I I don't always know what's going on, and it's going to be hard to replicate that every year if I do just spontaneous. So part of my peace of mind is using a little bit of yeast to inoculate. It also gives me another thing that I can change about some lots too, using different yeast. But spontaneous is also really cool because you have slower, longer fermentation. So one of my I did a big fun skin ferment, and why not do that spontaneous? It's got so much yeast on it. The skins are in there. It was a skin fermented Riesling. I feel like even if I put yeast in there, it would probably be the native yeast that was on there. And I loved it because I could kind of just let it tick away and do its thing slowly. And I think the extraction was really fun because it never got as hot, and it was really, a cold extracted wine during the ferment. And the slower the fermentation, the different levels of extraction you get and all these things. But that was a fun thing to play around with. I think I don't really know what necessarily decides it. I would probably play around with doing more spontaneous fermentations with like my semi-dries and my semi-sweet wines, just because if something were to happen with the ferment and it were to get stuck, it wouldn't be a big deal, if there's sugar left behind. So I might play around with that this year. That's something I want to do. But there are some wines that, we make such little wine at Barnstormer. We're like max 4,000 cases, probably 4,500. So I have to get some of our wines dry, and I have to know that they're going to get dry. Because if I don't have options to blend things in, and again, we're single vineyard. So if, if all of my Rieslings are sweet one year because it gets really cold in November or something, and also another point on that, we're really small. I have to be able to ensure that some things go dry, and we have to bottle everything at a certain time every year. Like I can't let a ferment go for 2 years and hope that it gets dry. I have to bottle it in March and April. So I kind of need to know that it's going to be there by the end of December typically, so I can start blending and figuring everything out and know volumes. And I also work in a cellar that is very cold in the winter, and there's no way my ferments will keep going through the winter. So that's another reason why I use yeast, which kind of takes the romance out of it. But at the end of the day, it's a business, and we have to make wine of a certain type sometimes. But
have you been in the situation where a native fermentation hasn't finished before the ambient temperature is so cold that it wants to stop it?
Yes, not my wine personally, but it's happened at other wineries I've worked at.
I see.
Yeah, for sure. I know wines that have gone like 2+ years before they get down to the dry level.
Right. I remember hearing that story.
And then another couple of wines that I've had that are just like ticking, and you put heaters on them and warm them up and add more yeast and pray every night that it's going to go to dryness.
That was going to be my next question, was if you find yourself in a position where a fermentation is taking too long, how do you coax it to the finish line?
Right. Yeah. I mean, depending on the style, like a Riesling, say it's a little sweeter than you want, we can work with that. That year, that vineyard could be a semi-dry. There's other varieties where, like a Chardonnay, I don't know if people really want a semi-dry Chardonnay. I don't know if I want to drink a semi-dry Chardonnay. Maybe it would be delicious, but that's one that I'm not confident playing around with as spontaneous yet, based on the kinetics of the cellar and just, numbers that we have to hit to sell the wine. But Riesling, like that's one thing that's so awesome about Riesling. Like you can, like, there's a lot of happy accidents that happen with that wine. So, and it can kind of be any style.
It does feel very forgiving in that way.
Yeah. It holds you accountable, and it's forgiving.
Like a good friend.
Yeah.
The next question I want to ask you is one that I've asked everybody so far, and probably will ask everybody after you.
I feel so special.
Regarding, I kind of feel like I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but I haven't given up on the thought of asking it. Regarding your philosophy on different additions to the wine in the cellar, I'm just going to ask a couple of things and see how you deal with them. Do you ever, depending on the vintage, would you ever acidify or deacidify, or is that verboten?
This is like the big Finger Lakes question. Acid. I have yet to acidify. I cannot imagine doing that here, but I know that it can be done, and it is done. My vineyard sites are pretty high acid, but I never say never. So I think I might have the same answer to all of your questions coming up about this, but if the wine dictates it, I will. I think it's nice to have all the tools in your tool belt to use. You just don't always have to use them.
Sure.
I did deacidify a wine for the very first time in my whole life.
Do you mind if I ask at least what variety it was?
It was our port.
Oh.
Yeah. And I only brought it down a little bit, but I wanted it to be really in balance.
Because texturally it needed a little less sharpness or something like that?
Yeah, and the question was kind of deacidify or add more sugar or, blend in something. So that was kind of the route I went because I liked where everything else was. And balance is the goal, right? With winemaking, at least for me. So that was the first time I ever did that. I think I learned that I can probably prevent that by just being a little bit more delicate with picking dates and maybe blending components next time. But I try and learn that way. Like if I need to deacidify something one year, maybe I don't pick it as early or try not to if I can. Or maybe I leave a little more sugar naturally in the ferment the next year. Instead of deacidifying that year, I try and just learn and then adapt the following vintage.
And that wine, I vaguely remember talking about it as you were vinifying it. You added the alcohol to halt fermentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that probably means that it didn't go through mallow, or if it started, it didn't finish.
Yeah.
So you don't really have the opportunity to tone down the acid through that.
No, you can't really use mallow, as a tool with port. I can't see how. Maybe people do.
It depends probably on how you decide to make it.
Right. Yeah.
What was your experience with did you use potassium bicarbonate to deacidify?
Yeah.
How did you feel after you added it? Like the effect on did it have the effect that you were hoping it would?
It did. Yeah. It definitely did what it's supposed to do. I felt...
It kind of feels like witchcraft because you add it and it gets fizzy, as I recall.
Or it gets really pasty. Mine was like a paste, like a milk paste. Yeah, I don't know. I felt kind of naughty adding it though. It was the first time I've ever added anything to change the chemistry of a wine other than sulfur. I've personally never done that. Wow,
interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of sulfur, are you adding sulfur on the press pad?
Yep.
How much? Or does it depend?
My ice cream scooper is 40 grams. So,
you're going off the scoop.
No, at the end of harvest, I go off the scoop because I've figured out the measurement of the scoop pretty well.
Jesus.
But no, I do about, I'll say it in ppms. I do I keep it kind of low. It depends on the variety. So, and what I'm going to do to it. I had Gruner come in that I wanted to cold soak for 5 days. I gave it like 100 ppm at the press pad.
Because you knew a lot of it was going to get bound up.
It was all going to get bound up. It was going to sit in those bins. So I hit it. You could do more. I don't think at the crush pad, you can add a lot of sulfur, but I typically do about 40 ppm when fruit arrives.
Onto the grapes or as you're pressing?
For red grapes, as we're crushing, I sprinkle it into the bin or sprinkle liquid, dissolved sulfur into the bin as I'm crushing into that bin. But with white grapes, I kind of just sprinkle it in when they arrive, and then because I cold soak a lot. So I give them sulfur and then let them sit for about 3 days typically, and then they get pressed. And I don't usually add more when I'm pressing, but I do kind of lean towards more of an oxidative juice protocol, I think.
Fair enough. Nutrient. What's your philosophy on when you add nutrient, if you're using fermade versus DAP, do you add nutrient at all? Hit me with your thinking.
Right. Yeah. I do add nutrients. I usually do a yeast rehydration nutrient.
Do you see any benefit in that as somebody who's never used that?
Oh, you haven't?
No.
God, we'd have to get really nerdy with it.
Sure.
I think to see a difference. Like the only difference I see is that it changes. God, is it the nucleation rate? It changes something legitimately the second you add it, and the yeast doesn't look as foamy. So at first I thought my yeasts were dead when I first started using it, but it just changes like the way the foam generates in your liquid.
Okay.
So that is a small difference.
Sure.
But
sorry, we don't have to go down the rabbit hole. I just wasn't sure if maybe you had an experience where you were like, I had this one time and it did this magical thing to this wine, and I've been trying to replicate it.
I just do it to give the yeast the best chance possible to kind of survive in this new crazy life that they're being thrown into.
Fair.
You know, yeah. I'm giving them all of their supplies, hopefully. I think keeping yeast healthy the whole time helps prevent reduction, you know, not just dealing with reduction when it arises. So there are times when I never notice reduction in a ferment ever, which sometimes I get a little bummed about. I'm like, come on, give me a little. I want a little of you. But
that's chaotic for something to hope for. I've gotten to the point where when I smell a fermentation has gotten reductive, I feel confident that I can coax it out of that state. But if I continue to be a winemaker with the same brain that I have now, who know how it's going to change, you know, by next year or whatever, if I had ferments that never got reductive ever again, I would be totally fine.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, I understand that. But I like a little bit of that reduction in there. And if it's the transient reduction, then I feel like I get excited. I get excited about that as much as I get excited about a clean ferment, I think.
No, based on the way that you described your relationship with reduction earlier, it makes sense.
But I do try and keep my yeast really healthy the whole way through. Also, I ferment pretty cold. So I keep everything around, I don't know, definitely under 60 Fahrenheit, but kind of closer to 54.
Why have you
55?
Settled on that temperature out of curiosity?
I wanted to, I think that, I don't know if this is like proven completely, but I kind of believe the philosophy of a cooler, slower ferment gives me qualities in the wine that I like a little bit better. And I think it retains some aromatics versus these hot, fast ferments. You know, it's kind of like cooking food, right? If you just boil everything off, you lose a lot of the flavor. But if you kind of do a slow, long simmer, I think you get more flavorful food. So cooking and winemaking is so similar. Again, you'd have to do a side by side to really know the difference. But I kind of like to see how cold I can get them and that they still get all the way to the finishing point.
Yeah.
It's kind of exciting. But that also keeps the reduction down a little bit and requires me, I think, to be really on top of yeast nutrition.
Sure. Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's been in my mind recently, I'd like to experiment with stretching out fermentations longer. Mm-hmm. And I am somebody who pretty much only ever inoculates wine. I have not experimented much with spontaneous fermentations. And so the way that I had considered doing it, you know, as I'm laying in bed at night is by lowering the temperature. And at this point, I'm used to fermenting around 60 degrees. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to hear that you're fermenting lower, because we'll have to talk more about your experience doing that, because that's something that, you know, in the name of having a long, cool fermentation, which I am hoping that there are benefits to, or kind of imagine that there could be benefits to.
I mean, you read something somewhere, right? And then you're like, I want to try that.
Yeah.
And then you like the result or you don't like it.
Right.
But, I mean, we talked a lot about stabulation
Right.
And I still want to do that. I still haven't truly done it. I did like a mini stabulation with the rosé last year, but not like the full 14 days or whatever.
Sure. Stabulation, for anybody outside of the know, Taylor, correct me if you have a different definition for what stabulation is, but when you press grapes, solids come with them. It's not clear juice. And normally the practice is to take the clear, let those solids settle and then take the clear juice off the top from those solids after they settle to the bottom of the tank. Well, stabulation is the practice of keeping the juice in contact with those solids for an amount of time and regularly like bubbling and stirring them up so that you're extracting whatever those grape solids, that organic material that's left over in the juice, has to offer into the juice. Because it has, goodies that you want in the wine.
Little nuggets.
This is actually, I wrote down a question here. You've talked a lot about doing skin contact with whites. What's the benefit that you see in doing that?
I think the biggest benefit that I've noticed, well, it makes them taste good. I like how
Would
they
not taste good without the skin contact?
It makes them taste gooder. But I think that it's, I don't know, I think the pH raising is, I've seen a big change in TA and pH from cold soaking.
I noticed that on this Riesling that we're drinking that I made, big pH rise.
And that can save you, that can be the difference between kind of a lemon water wine and something with complexity.
And a lush texture.
Yeah. If that's what you want, like, I think that for me, it's, I like just adding, I like trying to ramp them up a little bit. I like trying to get as much from the grapes as I can, without, making them bitter or overripe or whatever. But I like trying to tease flavor out for beyond just the classic press, ferment, bottle. And so again, you have to do side by sides to really get your answers with this. But I think that cold soaking adds a little bit of texture and flavor. And even if it's tiny, I really like the result of it. And I see the chemistries change. So I do see, the difference in the juice chemistries from when I bring them in to when I'm then pressing them. And I compare, and it's really exciting to see your pHs go up from like 3.2 all the way up to 3.6 or something.
Well, this Riesling that I made saw 2 days on the skins. And there was definitely a distinction, I think, stylistically in how the wine turned out.
Yeah.
And so the thought of doing 4 days seems fairly aggressive from my standpoint.
Yeah, it's a little scary. It's definitely scary. Things start to turn brown, and you get a little bit of funky smells on top.
Are you using any like dry ice or anything?
No, I don't have dry ice.
So it's just kind of like ambient temperature.
Pretty much, yeah. It's cold soaking is definitely a bit of a misnomer because I don't have the ability to like truly cold soak. But by the time I'm picking Riesling, nighttime is pretty cold. My cellar stays pretty cold. So just the contact, and I will crush and destem and then cold soak. So you rip up the skins a little bit. You add a little bit of agitation and you get a little bit more extraction from that. And then I do press pretty hard, but then I also do a whole cluster, soft, almost like champagne press cycle, like really delicate. So it's, I like making all the different types of Riesling. So there isn't like one true style, but
sure.
Again, it's kind of what the vineyard is asking for, or allowing for.
Sure.
But I think that it does do something, or at least I want to believe that it does.
It absolutely does. I just was looking for, based on your knowledge and experience, what your expectations were or what the impetus was for making that stylistic choice.
Yeah.
Couple more things that I just want to touch on. I know we've been talking for a little bit now. Are you filtering all your wines, and how intensely?
Yes, everything gets filtered before bottling.
Does everything just get filtered down to sterile on principle?
Everything gets filtered down to sterile on principle. I have a lot of residual sugar in my wines because we do all the way up to like dessert wines and fortified wines. So those definitely have to be filtered. And then, everything goes through a really gentle cross flow before it gets bottled. And I really like the result. I don't notice a huge difference between the pre-bottled wine and post-bottled wine, but I mean, we can kind of do whatever we want. If I wanted to not filter, I could, but since I don't notice a big sensory difference, why not filter? You know, if it still tastes great, then why not just give it that one last little bit of protection before sending it off to the world? You know,
Sure.
Things re-ferment all the time. That's definitely possible. And also, you know, it's just kind of like that last little peace of mind before releasing it to people who you don't have control over what they do with it.
Right. Okay, I want to ask you about two niche wines that I know that you made / are making.
Mm-hmm.
The first is you made a pet nat, Saperavi.
No, it's Sangiovese.
Oh, okay. There's not a lot of that in the Finger Lakes.
No, there's a couple rows planted down at Sawmill Creek Vineyard in Hector, and we are contracted for all of them.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So did you make it just once or have you made it a couple of times?
Yeah, so that was 2022.
That you made it for the first time?
Yeah, that was my first year at Barnstormer, and they always do a big volume of Sangiovese Rosé at Barnstormer. That's kind of like one of our cult following niche wines that we do. And it came in maybe 0.2 tons, 0.4 tons, very small amount. So I ended up getting like 50 gallons of juice out of it, basically. So I was like, what do I do with this? It was beautiful. It was pink, super small lot. Wanted to add a little bit of value to the product. And because it was such a small lot, I thought that would be a super manageable pet nat to do. And it was a pretty color. And I've never done a pet nat before. And it was super fun. Yeah. So we actually disgorged it and I dosaged it with late harvest Riesling juice that I had saved from harvest and just sulfured down and put in the fridge.
So you added some SO2 hoping that it wouldn't re-ferment?
Yeah. I added a lot of I actually used the late harvest Riesling juice as the dosage. So I added enough sulfur to the late harvest Riesling juice to then dosage the wine with, like you would with a sparkling wine.
Sure.
But that turned into my kind of like dosage solution. And yeah, it was pretty yummy.
What's the turbidity like post disgorging? I mean, is it clear or?
No, this one, I think it can be. I didn't have the ability to freeze the neck. And I just got it really cold.
You had to disgorge à la volée?
Yes. I just did it out on the pad. Tried not to let it warm up. And it wasn't a perfectly clean disgorging, but it was pretty good. Like, compared to what it would have been without disgorging it, I was really happy with how it came out. And we only lost probably like a case worth of volume or 2 cases. So it wasn't too much.
Out of what is 50 gallons, like 23 cases or 25 cases?
I think we ended up with like 18.
Okay, after it was all said and done.
Yeah, the end product. So it was a very small amount. But
is that a wine that Barnstormer will continue to produce?
I think they've made pet nat in the past before me, and that was a fun one to make. And I think we'll definitely make it again. The labor of it is the only thing that kind of deters us because after harvest, I don't have an intern anymore, and I want to get to the point where I don't have to disgorge it. So I want to kind of hone in the pet nat winemaking process. So I'm not hand disgorging a bunch of pet nat by myself in the winter, basically, which, you know, is fun, but it's a lot. That's a really high cost for a product that we just kind of want to make and have it be a little bit easier.
For sure.
Yeah.
And the last thing that I want to ask you about is your vermouth.
Yes.
All I really know about it is that you've talked about doing some trials with like different spices and that you post Instagram pictures about it.
Yeah.
So will you tell me, like, hit me with all the deets. What was the impetus? What's the volume? Where are you in the process? How are you feeling about it? That sort of thing.
Cool. Yeah, this is probably the thing I'm most excited about right now. We had some leftover semi-dry Riesling 2 years ago, and I went out and collaborated with some local farmers for botanicals, and I just got a bunch of stuff from them and did a bunch of trials with what worked with the Riesling, and then found a botanical recipe that I wanted to bulk up. And at this point in time, we are bottled and labeled.
Damn.
And it is ready for purchase. I have a couple lots of it. So it's 100% Riesling based. And then I added neutral grape spirit and some burnt sugar, and then a bunch of herbs and botanicals and bark, and some citrus. So there's a lot of fun stuff in it, all locally sourced, which is really cool. And one of the lots, so I have it in like a drum, so I pull it out into buckets to infuse because I don't want to add plants to this drum because I'll never be able to clean them out. So I infuse everything in these buckets. And then one day I came in and the way I do the vermouth, I don't know how traditionally vermouth is made, like in-house, like how actually everyone's doing it behind the scenes. But I didn't really have a whole lot of volume to work with. So I wanted to kind of I was layering in the botanicals. So I would add chamomile and see how that affected the wine. And if I thought that was good, then I would add in cinnamon, and then I would add in orange slices, and kind of every new thing I added, I did on its own. And just like responded to that. And then I was like, oh, we're going in kind of like a spicy cinnamon orange direction. Let's add, cardamom. And then I was like, oh, I really like the cardamom. Let's see what cardamom pods taste like versus leaves. And, just kind of played around with it, and then compared dried flowers to fresh flowers and dried citrus to fresh citrus. So just every step of the way, adding new things. We've gotten up to like 30 botanicals, I think, at this point.
Whoa.
Maybe a little less. I need to do the final count. But one of the botanicals I added, shiso, plum shiso, is very beautiful purple leafed plant. And it dyed one of the lots pink.
Really?
And I didn't think about that when I was adding in bunches and bunches of shiso, because I'd added a small amount in the past and for like the small bench trials, and it didn't change any color. And the whole lot got dyed pink. So I reserved that in a carboy and bottled that up by itself. And then another one I did turned like this beautiful orange color. So that one's isolated by itself too. And then I have the Riesling one that I haven't put them back into. So I've got a white, an orange, and a pink right now. And I'm going to bottle them all separately. And yeah, currently you cannot taste it at the winery, but there's a couple local bars and stuff that are going to start selling it.
Oh, so will it be available ever at the winery?
It'll be available to buy, and
or maybe online.
It's definitely available online, and it's available to purchase at the winery. We're not tasting it because it's got such a small volume. But you can go to Microclimate and you can drink it, or Nobody's in Syracuse. But there's going to be a lot more made in the future because we're very excited about it.
So just so I understand,
it's a lower ABV Spanish style kind of sipping vermouth that I have always wanted to make since going to Spain and enjoying vermouth at a bar just with an orange slice and an ice cube in it. And I thought it was such a fun cocktail.
How much ABV is there?
18%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's up there, but it's not like, or the final lot is probably closer to 16%, but it's between 16 and 18% depending on which lot you're getting, but it's not a super high spirited vermouth compared to some others.
Sure.
I think.
So you started with a drum, you said.
Yeah.
And then it got broken down into buckets.
Yeah.
Does that mean 60 divided by 5, like 12 buckets?
There was a lot of buckets at one point. Yeah.
So Okay, and these are the separate lots that you're kind of talking
They're now
about.
in glass carboys. All
Like
the different lots.
12 of them, or a number of them?
Currently, the buckets got added back into the drum.
Okay.
As I would infuse in the buckets and then filter that out and then get it back into the drum. But I currently have 3 lots that are separated based on color because I think the color is really fun.
So you have some very niche ones and then a slightly larger one.
Yeah, and then the white one, the classic one, is a little bit larger. Yeah.
Interesting. That sounds super cool.
Yeah, maybe we should do a vermouth flight and just try all 3.
You took the words out of my mouth. I mean, that sounds...
When I was making this like in the summer, when I wanted to drink vermouth with an orange slice and some sparkling water and an ice cube, and I think that as I learn about the things I want to make, it's because I want to make something that I want to drink, and that I want to see this region be able to do as well. Sure.
That's super interesting. I'm glad I asked about that. I'm thrilled that you were able to share this experience.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's definitely a fun project. I'm excited that it's going to be an actual thing. Seeing like a label come in, on a roll of something that you've just been like fantasizing about is a really cool moment.
Like a dream come true.
Yeah.
For the last question, would you just hit me with what you will drink with dinner tonight, whether that's water or something that's not water?
What will I drink with dinner tonight? Or
maybe on average, what you drink for dinner? A cocktail,
I've
seltzer.
been making a lot of black tea free chai at night with spices because I have a lot of spices.
Is that because the black tea has caffeine and you don't want to caffeinate?
Yeah, it's like a gingery, turmeric-y, cardamom-y, chai, milky drink that I drink at night.
Chai is the perfect answer to come off of a vermouth talk, I think.
I've been in a botanical mood, I think.
Exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for spending an hour and a half chatting with me about all your goings on. This was a great conversation, and maybe we'll find some unique topic to talk about in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all so much for listening. I'm thrilled you could make it to the end of the podcast. If you have any thoughts on questions you'd like me to ask or comments about your experience, I'd love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to email me at eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day.